I first met Malcolm at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, and I became a member of WIPS when I was 18. And it's really nice for me to be back here in Colorado. I've been here before in Colorado. It's very nice for me to be here at a WIPS meeting because it's important for me to actually show what your hard-earned money and all your time you put into WIPS has actually resulted in. I've actually had projects funded by WIPS 4 times, and the first of which was just a couple of years after I'd met Malcolm, so very much at my sort of earliest part of my professional career, just when it was really beginning to get off the ground. And so it's a real pleasure to genuinely be here and be able to show you some of the work I've been involved in. And I'm sure that you'll agree that it's really interesting stuff. Well, I hope by the end of this talk I'll convince you all. So first and foremost, it is an age-old interest. I'm sure everybody here can relate to this. And I've genuinely been fascinated by paleontology, dinosaurs, the natural world, and fossils and co since I was a little boy. And this is on my 4th birthday. And I demanded that I had a dinosaur birthday cake, and I got it, which is amazing. But it seems, I literally was just fascinated by all the subjects of paleontology. Now, I come from Doncaster, as Malcolm mentioned. For those of you who don't know, Doncaster is in the UK. It's in Yorkshire. It's in South Yorkshire specifically. And it's known for quite a few things. It's quite famous for having medieval castle, Conisbrough Castle. Very famous for horse racing, which has been in the town since the early 1100s. And also for fossils, it's a coal mining town. And there's lots and lots of mines throughout Doncaster, of which now sadly have all closed. And lots of fossils were found. And we'll touch upon that later. So my WIPS connection starts out in Wyoming. And it was at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center where I'd earned enough money to fund this trip, which almost was about 4 months in Wyoming. And it was basically, this was my first real big experience in paleontology. I was 18 at the time, and I'd already sort of spent time in the UK collecting fossils and sort of reading books and all that sort of stuff. But I really wanted some sort of proper professional experience. So I went out to the Wyoming Dinosaur Center. It seemed like an excellent institution to go to. It would be the first time I would actually be around professional paleontologists, people excavating dinosaurs, all these sort of things I'd read about as a child in books. And it seemed that, just by chance, I met this chap, Malcolm. And with Malcolm, we had many discussions. I worked with Malcolm on his site at FS, which I'm sure some of you have been to. And we had a very long chat. And we also had, I recall, a long drive from Wyoming to Colorado, where I attended the Denver General Mineral Show way back in 2008. But Malcolm told me about WIPS. And I said, well, Malcolm, how do I really get into paleontology? And he said, well, WIPS may be able to help with that. And so I became a member when I was 18. Now, whilst I was in Wyoming, and as I mentioned, I got the chance to work with Malcolm, I also worked on a variety of other projects. So excavating dinosaurs, understanding mapping techniques, preparing fossils, molding and casting, and building exhibitions as well. And here it was comparing a Triceratops skeleton with a Triceratops that we'd mold and cast. And this was, again, really interesting and a massive sort of eye-opener for me because you can imagine, I'm 18, I've read about all this stuff, I've been out collecting fossils since I was a little boy, but I'd never, in a million years, had the opportunity like this to be around actual real specimens and taking part in science and building exhibitions and studying material. Now, after my time in Wyoming, I'd met, obviously, Malcolm and various other now friends and colleagues, and they said, well, have you got a local museum? I said, well, yeah, I do. I grew up in Doncaster, and there's a museum, Doncaster Museum and Art Gallery. But I recall that when I was younger, I went to this museum, and they never had any fossils on display. And they had some funding, this big project in the museum, way back when I was about 10 years old. I still remember this. And they said, oh, we're going to get dinosaurs on display. And I went back to the museum after this funding had sort of gone through, and they never had dinosaurs on display, so I vowed never to go back. And so this was until 2008 when I decided, okay, I'll break that sort of vow and I'll go back to the museum. Well, it turned out, from having some initial contact with one of the curators, I was an archaeologist, I found out that they didn't have a paleontologist. The last paleontologist, in fact, died when he died in 1911. And this archaeologist said, oh, yeah, well, we have a couple of fossils. I thought, oh, okay, maybe a couple of ammonites or belemnites. Well, no, it turns out they had over 12,000 specimens. And including this as an example, this was me literally on my return from Wyoming. This was when I was 18. My hair was a little bit longer then. and I'm examining a dinosaur bone which was in the collections. And this resulted in this mini exhibition, which was an exhibition about the sort of rediscovered museum collection and also about some of the material I'd collected from out in Wyoming and from childhood, basically. Now, funding from WIPS essentially led to this project, which is called the Circa project. Now, the Circa project was put in place to examine the paleontology collection, approximately 12,000 specimens, in great, great detail. So, as I mentioned, the guy who was previously there, the paleontologist, he died in 1912. So you can imagine what this collection was like, just hidden away in the back. And nobody at all had ever been through this collection. The last geologist, she was more interested in minerals, and she wasn't necessarily interested in the fossils. Now, she retired during the mid-1980s. And so, again, no even geologists had been in this collection. So it was a bunch of archaeologists. So you can imagine that the collection wasn't necessarily in its greatest state. For example, when we're going through the collection, we found many, many specimens like this ammonite. You can see this as pyrite decay, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The pyrite decay had taken over this ammonite and almost completely destroyed it. Now, as part of this process, I was consulted as a curator of paleontology for the Circa project, working with this guy, Nigel Larkin, who's a conservator, and a friend of mine, Jason Sherburn, who had been completing a undergraduate degree at the University of Portsmouth, and he was sort of enlisted to volunteer and work with me on going through the entire collection. Now, the initial collection was stored like this. These are actually cabinets from a bank that were given to the museum back in the 70s. And you can see that this is not ideal for paleontology collections. You know, you had these cardboard boxes, specimens laying on top of each other. I mean, if we opened up one of these boxes, you had things like fossil plants rolling around next to trilobites, rolling around next to ammonites, and all just rubbing together. And you can imagine the state of the collection wasn't very good. And so this Circa project really was in place to transform all of the collection entirely. So take it from this and put it into new storage, which is brilliant storage, and completely catalog everything, re-identify material, and go through all of this stuff and put new labels and also transfer material to other relevant institutions. And that's finally resulted in a mini sort of redisplay, which ended up being a semi-permanent exhibition, which is still on display at Doncaster Museum, where we took this sort of newfound information and put it together in this exhibition. And so this was Fossil Wonders, a Hidden Collection Awakened. It's only a mini exhibition, but it highlights some of the important material rediscovered. And so this was a WIPS, essentially a WIPS-funded project. They put towards this project, which was a much larger project in theory, but the funding from WIPS allowed for this initial sort of research of the collection and to understand that it was important. Now, another thing is an unexpected ichthyosaur. So in Doncaster Museum, there was an unusual sort of ichthyosaur which is in the collections. But my sort of story with this ichthyosaur starts here, in the middle of nowhere. This is in Wyoming, and this is also in 2008. So again, by chance, I was out collecting with this chap, Bill Wall, and this lady, Professor Judy Messere, who Judy Messere has become, and Bill Wall have become great friends of mine, and much of my academic research has been spent working with Judy. Well, the funny thing is, at this time, again, this was when I was 18, I found out that Judy was coming. They were going on this big excavation, and I said, oh, can I take part in this? And so Judy and Bill encouraged me to look at marine reptiles. They specialize in marine reptiles. I thought, oh, this sounds really interesting. You know, I've had no concept of what sort of academia is in retrospect. You know, I'd looked at sort of read books, but I never looked at any academic papers. And in fact, when I was at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, there was lots of people, you know, students and paleontologists going around saying, oh, have you seen the latest paper? Have you seen this paper? And me being very naive, thought they meant newspapers. So that went down very well. But this is the specimen we were collecting. It doesn't look like much there, but we plaster jacketed the specimen, we removed it from the field, and it was a fourth in a paddle of a plesiosaur, a thing called Megaloneusaurus rex. And this is from the upper Jurassic of Wyoming. And so during this time, this was really important for me because meeting Bill and Judy and spending time with them really opened up my eyes a little bit more to marine reptiles. And they encouraged me to go back to the UK and look at material. And this is where it comes into Doncaster. So this is the ichthyosaur, which was hidden behind the scenes at Doncaster Museum. Now, it's an ichthyosaurus, but I like to call it a different name, as Nobodysaurus, because literally this specimen had been hidden behind the scenes until I came along to study this. This is a photo back in, I think, 2009. And it turns out this specimen was misidentified as a plaster copy, and children were encouraged to draw on this and to do brass rubbings of the ribs. Now, you sort of picture this. When I was 18, going through the collections, you had an education manager come to me and say, oh, we have a plaster copy of an ichthyosaur that you can use in this upcoming exhibition. So I go to look at this specimen surrounded by several curators, and I tell them this isn't a plaster copy, it's real. And they say, oh, well, that can't be right. We let kids draw on it. And it's like, well, yeah, stop them doing that. So I got confirmation that, you know, it was real, and they said, oh, great. So we took it out of there, had it all conserved. And this actually ended up forming my first peer-reviewed paper, which I began to write when I was 18, and it was published when I was 20. And if we focus on this dark mass in here where the arrows point, this is a fish scale, and completely packed throughout this dark mass are these hooklets, which are from the arms of squid. So we know about 189 million years ago, this ichthyosaur was feeding upon squid and fish. And that's really important. This was a thing which was misidentified as a plaster copy. And in fact, it turned out to be really quite important. And we'll come back to this specimen later. Now, another project that was sort of indirectly funded by WIPS was during the initial research of the collections of Doncaster, I came across these things, which are, again, at Doncaster Museum Art Gallery. These are eurypterids. They are essentially sea scorpions. And I rediscovered 23 specimens hidden behind the scenes. Well, the funny thing is, I managed to find out that they were all collected as part of this huge collection way back in the 1700s, early 1800s, by this gentleman, Dr. Hunter Selkirk. And most of his material went to the Kilmarnock Museum, but surprisingly, 23 specimens and a few other bits and pieces wound up at Doncaster Museum. Well, the funny thing is that this material is all from the Silurian of Scotland, and they belong to a species, Eratopterus and Slimonia, which are very, very rare now because all of the sites are long gone. And so, again, all this stuff was just hidden behind the scenes, and nobody's ever looked at this. And that resulted in another paper. Now, here are some of the highlight examples. These are some of the appendages from one of the eurypterids. Here's one of the heads. You can see, even on the side, the oval eye. And here's one of the tailsons. You can see right at the back, the spike at the back of the tail. And these are exceptionally well preserved. And again, I look quite young there, but here's the biggest specimen. It's practically complete. Here's where the tailson is. It goes all the way forward, and you've got the head here. That was a good close-up of it, actually, and that scale bar is 10 centimeters. I mean, this is quite a beastie, one of the biggest specimens found. Now, another project, again, indirectly funded by WIPS, is this, an ichthyosaur and embryos. So, ichthyosaurs are unusual in terms of reptiles in that they actually give birth to live young. They don't lay eggs. And this was a skeleton that was collected in the 1800s, first reported in 1880. And whilst on a routine visit with Judy Messere, we were walking through the Sedgwick Museum collections in Cambridge, and we came across this specimen, and it wasn't the genus that we were looking at. We were looking at a different genus, looking at Ichthyosaurus, but we thought this was interesting because it can be identified as an example of Leptonectes, but at the other end, these blocks fit up neatly, and they are historically recorded that you have this little skull here and the body, and there's some other little vertebrae. Well, it turns out that this is one embryo, and it's affiliated with this specimen, but this has never been described in detail as an embryo. Now, this was the very first report of this particular genus, a particular type of ichthyosaur, Leptonectes, with embryos. So we had this beautiful embryo, and it's from the Low Jurassic of Somerset. And then this here, all these very small vertebrae are from this one, and that is also another embryo preserved in this ichthyosaur. And this, again, was an indirectly funded project by WIPS. Now, another one, which was also indirectly funded, which came out of the result of the initial work at Doncaster Museum, was a fossil guide book for Whitby. Now, Whitby is on the Yorkshire coast in the UK. It's a site that I grew up collecting fossils from. I used to go here as a child, but there was never any book to identify my finds. Now, the Jurassic cliffs are about 180, 160 million years old. You know, there's many wonderful, wonderful discoveries being found, including likes of this pliosaur, crocodile, and a whole swath of other things. And this resulted in a book, Fossils of the Whitby Coast, that was published in 2011. And it was sort of an idea of mine that I had, essentially, I guess, since I was a child, because I couldn't identify my things readily. And this was important for me to be able to help other people to understand what they can find there and what they can identify. So there's a couple of examples of my favorite specimens that are featured in the book. Include this big thing. It's about 8.5 meters long, this huge skeleton of an ichthyosaur, which is on display in York Museum. And then this is a very, very rare skull of a pterosaur that was found way back in the 1800s. In fact, both specimens are from the early mid-1800s. Now, if I go back to the Doncaster Museum, a couple of years ago, after looking at the specimen and realizing that it wasn't a plastic copy, that it was real, I began to do a lot more research on this specimen. And having teamed up with Judy Missere, we decided that we needed to look at this stuff in more detail. So we kind of set up on this worldwide tour of examining lots and lots and lots of ichthyosaurus material so that we could try and understand what the specimen at Doncaster was. And it turns out that by looking at the humerus, so if we focus on where this arrow is, this is one humerus, this is another, we had these prepared and removed completely so we could examine them in 3 dimensions. It turns out it was a new species. And this specimen was to be the holotype of the new species. Now you might be wondering why a beach full of shells has anything to do with a new species. Has anybody heard of that? This tongue twister. Okay. Well, this tongue twister is said to be inspired by a fantastic woman in science called Mary Anning. And Mary Anning was a little bit of a hero of mine growing up. Now, there's no real truth into this, whether it was inspired by her, but it still reminds me of Mary. And together, me and Judy, we decided that we were going to name the new species in honor of Mary Anning. Now, if you've not heard of Mary Anning before, she lived in Lyme Regis in Dorset. She made amazing, amazing discoveries, the first at the age of 11, 12 years old. She was a young girl walking out on the beach collecting stuff. And she placed Lyme Regis and Britain on the map for paleontology. She's an incredible woman. And the strange thing is that nobody ever named a species after her in terms of ichthyosaurs, and yet she brought ichthyosaurs to the attention of the scientific world. So it's our honor to name this Ichthyosaurus anningae in honor of Mary Anning. And as part of this study, we found an additional 5 specimens, including this one, which serendipitously was collected by Mary Anning, which is quite incredible. And it's in the collections of the Natural History Museum in London. Now, interestingly, by looking at this specimen and comparing it specifically to the one at Doncaster, we also found possibility of sexual dimorphism in the humerus of Ichthyosaurus anningae. That is, we can possibly distinguish between males and females by looking at the bones. So you can see, as an example, you've got this sort of bulbous area here and this very big ridge. On here, this is missing. And so it's possible that we think maybe this was used for something during mating, and this could be the male and this could be the female, which is very difficult to understand looking at dimorphism, sexual dimorphism in the fossil record. And so that was kind of sort of groundbreaking, I guess, in the studies of ichthyosaurs, at least at the time. Now, another hidden gem that we found, which again was indirectly funded by WIPS, was this thing. We wanted to go through the museum, as part of our sort of big focus on studying ichthyosaurs, me and Judy wanted to focus on not necessarily all the big museums, but some of the smaller museums as well. And it's very important that we do that, because we can find things like this. Now, this is a beautiful skeleton, practically complete, and it was collected by Mary Anning. Never been described before in any scientific detail. Again, hidden behind the scenes of a museum. So you can imagine, collected by Mary Anning around about, I think it was the 1830s. And it turns out that this was purchased by Adam Sedgwick in 1832. And we even have the letters between Sedgwick and Mary Anning to examine, yet this had never been reported in any scientific detail describing what it is. And it turns out that it's actually the most complete example of a species called Ichthyosaurus breviceps, which also has the complete pelvis. Oh, go back. The complete pelvis. So you have this bone here, is the ilium. This is the ilium. This is the ischium, the pubis, ischium and pubis. And that's complete. That was the first time ever for Ichthyosaurus breviceps. And this was a historic specimen. See, it's often that in paleontology there's a mindset that most of the stuff, if it's in a museum, it's already kind of been done. And so one of our key things we want to do is to go back into museums, review all the stuff which is sort of hidden away in these collections, and we can find incredible fossils. Now, another one, again indirectly funded by WIPS, was looking at the largest specimen. Now, Ichthyosaurus length, it's not a particularly huge type of ichthyosaur, but there's four species here which they range in they're roughly equal in size. Communis is 2 meters, Breviceps 2 meters, Coniberi is 1.5 meters, and Anningae we estimate is 2 meters. This is all in total length. Well, we examined this thing, which is a very, very big forefin. It's just sadly an isolated forefin, and the scale bar there is 10 centimeters. Now, this is in the York Museum. we did a bunch of regression analyses were undertaken looking at this, comparing it to lots and lots of other ichthyosaurs, 100 ichthyosaurus humeri, and the humerus versus skull in 25 specimens, and the humerus versus the vertebral column in 25 specimens. And we come to an estimate that this thing, whatever it belonged to, this skeleton, would have been at least from the tip of the snout to the end of the tail of about 3 meters, which increases the size at range of obviously the other species. Unfortunately, because it was so fragmentary, it's just this forefin, we were unable to identify this to a specific species, but perhaps that may happen in the future. Now, having said that, some of you may have seen recently the report of the sort of largest ichthyosaurus, which was actually a study of mine. It was picked up, Malcolm mentioned, by the New York Times, but it was also picked up by National Geographic and the BBC, and it was featuring this specimen. So some of you may have seen this in the news. It seemed to go that the media went crazy over this thing. And this was a specimen that was hidden away in a museum again, but this was collected more recently in the 90s. It ended up going to a private collector in Germany until eventually he donated the specimen to Hanover Museum in Germany. And nobody looked at this. A colleague of mine walking through the museum earlier this year said, "Oh, wow, I've seen, they found another specimen, you may be of interest." About a week later, I flew out there to go and see this thing. And it's the largest example now known of ichthyosaurus. This is probably altogether about 3.5 meters. If you ignore this tail, because the tail has all been added, it's a composite, all the tail is from another animal. So we had to go through that. That was an issue. But the skull length is almost 60 centimeters, which is the largest as well for an ichthyosaurus. Now, this was one project specifically funded by WIPS, and this was looking at a new ichthyosaur, this beautiful specimen, which is at the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. Now, initially, when I began to look at this with Judy, we thought that maybe this could be a new species because it showed some unusual features. Well, anyway, the specimen was collected during the 1980s from Doniford Bay in Watchett, and it was purchased by National Museum of Wales in 1992. Now, the funny thing with this is that it wasn't behind the scenes, it was on display, and nobody looked at it, again. And you can see a common theme here. And it turns out this was an example of a rare species of ichthyosaurus called Ichthyosaurus coniberi. And until the description of Ichthyosaurus anniae, coniberi was thought to be sort of the most well-understood species, but it turns out that it actually isn't, because there's only few specimens known. And the characters used to define the species overlap and do not necessarily suggest that it was a distinct species. So this resulted in the fact that coniberi was a questionable species that needed to be sort of re-examined. So this new specimen shed light on coniberi. Now, as part of this study, we had to look back at the original description of coniberi by a guy called Lydekker in 1888. Now, he announced this new species defined on a very small partial skeleton on display at the Natural History Museum in London. Now, one problem with this is not only is it a partial skeleton with a damaged skull, and it is incomplete, the worst thing is that it's behind glass, and we still can't access the specimen for any measurements. So that's a pain. But the initial interpretation of this was based on that it had a long, delicate snout, and it had this thing called notching on the forefin, where the arrows point out here. This was a problem because a guy called McGowan, Chris McGowan, who was an excellent paleontologist back in 1974, he referred another specimen to coniberi, but on the basis of very limited material. He used ratios of the snout length to further distinguish the species. Now, if we compare this bottom specimen, this is the second specimen that McGowan referred to coniberi, and you can see there's obviously clear similarities between this thing. You've got to ignore this because that is also reconstructed, the bit prior to the yellow bar. And comparing these two and trying to look back at the original holotype of coniberi resulted in the skull, humerus, and pelvis features of coniberi all being unique. These are the humeri. This is of the National Museum of Wales specimen. This is of the other referred specimen by McGowan. And we also managed to track down the geographic and stratigraphic range for a couple of these specimens, which is really important at trying to understand when these things lived. And you can see a comparison between the two skulls. You've got this really massive orbit in both specimens, and all of the bones surrounding the skull and in the jaw all match up as well. So we were confident this was a new example of coniberi, so a rare example of a species. Now, another one that was also funded sort of indirectly by WIPS was two new species, and this was essentially 2 centuries of weight. Now, this example is an example of a new species that we described. There's hundreds and hundreds of specimens were collected from the countryside, British countryside in Somerset, and this specimen is in the collection of a guy called Joseph Channing Pearce. Now, Joseph Channing Pearce was a massive, prolific collector in the UK, and he amassed a huge, huge collection. In 1915, this specimen was purchased by the University of Bristol. Sorry, no, it wasn't. It was purchased by Bristol Museum and eventually donated to the University of Bristol in 1930, where, again, although this was on display, passed by thousands of people, nobody had looked at it. And this turns out, that didn't form a collection, this turns out to be a new species, which I've worked a lot with this chap, Nigel Larkin. We decided to name after him. So this is Ichthyosaurus larkini, and this is the holotype specimen. And we've now found about 5 specimens of larkini, maybe a couple more, which will hopefully be unveiled soon. Now, this is the other one, named after Somerset, Ichthyosaurus somersetensis. But this, I think, has perhaps even a more interesting story. Now, in my personal opinion, this is the best example of the genus Ichthyosaurus ever found. It's a beautiful, complete skeleton. But interestingly, this was likely collected in the Glastonbury area in the 1840s. But this is where it kind of twists a little bit, is that it was sold at auction in Bristol to Edward Wilson of Tenby, Wales. Now, Ed decided to send this to Delaware, USA, for his brother, Dr. Thomas Wilson. So this specimen was then donated to the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences in 1847. And once again, nobody had seen this. Most likely because, of course, why would a Somerset specimen be in the Academy of Natural Sciences? It had never been on display. And it just literally by chance, my colleague Judy, she decided to drop the Academy of Natural Sciences an email and just inquire whether they had anything historically. And their curator was very happy to say, yeah, we have quite a few things. And so this turns out to be the holotype specimen of that species, somersetensis. Now, they differ substantially. At the top is larkini, and here is somersetensis, and this is communis. And then what we essentially did was looked at the different skull bones. You don't need to memorize all these things, but there's various different bones in the skull, and they're very different between each of the examples we found. And we found somersetensis. There's at least 30, 40 specimens known of that species. And they also differed substantially in the humerus bone as well. So you can see, again, some differences. You've got larkini, somersetensis. You can see the shape of these things are very, very different, coniberi, aningae. And so we were very confident in that. We have discovered 2 new species. Now, 2 species, talking about discovering new species, we also have collapsed species as well. So for a very long time, historically, there were 2 species thought to be, well, there's a bit of a controversy. And it was thought that there was one species, was McGowan in 1974, and McGowan and Mattani in 2003, in these 2 major studies. And they thought they were just one species. But there's another camp of researchers who thought there were 2 species. Now, historically, these were described in more detail by Conybeare, 1822. And this was Ichthyosaurus communis and Ichthyosaurus intermedius. Now, he made the distinction in tooth morphology, and you can see that there is a clear difference in tooth form here. What Conybeare had pointed out was that intermedius had more acutely conical teeth, more slender, and striations less prominent, and less prominent root striations. And again, you can see the differences here. But there's a problem with this in that, at this time, there wasn't that many specimens to compare to. Now, tooth form varies ontogenetically. That is, it varies from juveniles to adults. And apparent morphology varies with the orientation and degree of preparation on a slab mound. That is where ichthyosaurs, most of these things from Dorset and Somerset are sort of pancaked, what I like to say. They're sort of laying on their side and they're not in 3 dimensions. And so this sort of degree of preparation on a slab mount can change the variation. More importantly, tooth form varies within an individual. And here's an example. So you have this portion of snout. This is a specimen at the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. Now, interestingly, if we point out one tooth form here, it's quite wide base crown. You can imagine that has this sort of tooth form of a communis. If you point out another here, this has sort of a tooth form which is similar to intermedius. And if you want to just throw an extra spanner in the works, you can see these things over here, which are another form entirely. And so after a very rigorous study, we managed to synonymize these and make sure that intermedius is in fact actually communis. So now intermedius is no longer considered a valid species. And this was a project also partially funded by WIPS. Now this is one which we're very excited about. This is a new dinosaur from Wyoming. Now the new dinosaur is nicknamed Laurie. It was found in 2000. It's from the Morrison Formation. It was collected in Douglas, Wyoming. That literally is almost the entire skeleton of Laurie. There's a little skull. There's a lower jaw. This is where the orbit would have been. You've got some of the leg bones here. Now, Laurie is an interesting specimen. It hasn't yet been formally described, but last year, working at the University of Wisconsin, I met up with Bill Wall, Scott Hartman, and Dave Lovelace to study this specimen in greater detail. And it turns out this thing is a new genus and species of Maniraptoran dinosaur. So it's similar to the sorts of things as Velociraptor and Troodontids. Now, WIPS funding, sort of to compare the WIPS funding. So initial research of Doncaster Museum was undertaken in 2010. That was one project that WIPS specifically funded. The determination of the Doncaster ichthyosaur as a new species was in 2013. The examination of a possible new ichthyosaur, which turns out to be an Ichthyosaurus conifera, was 2014. And then most recently, WIPS have funded partially the study of Laurie, which is 2016. Now, altogether, those 4 projects, total funding was £2,068, which roughly was $2,660. Now, that's resulted in 11 publications. And so hopefully, that's good money, good value for money. Now, there's a bit of a sales pitch there, but no, seriously, hopefully, you can see that the funding from WIPS has been, so vital to me and my co-authors to help with accommodation, travel, and actually to research these things and result in 11 publications. Now, aside from that, so a little bit more now about my research in academia. So I've been working professionally now as a paleontologist for about 10 years. I initially held off university. I immersed myself straight into the environment of paleontology by going out to Wyoming. It sort of opened my eyes. If I wouldn't have gone to the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, I don't know how else I'd have gone into paleontology. It really is the sort of backbone of my career. And after going out there, one door sort of opened, the next door opened, and I initially held off university. Much reasoning was for the fact that there's so few jobs in paleontology, and there's so many people that it's super competitive. So I wanted to find my sort of niche in life and figure out where it is I could fit in. And so, having initially held off university, I was eventually approached by the University of Manchester to be given this position as a visiting scientist, and this started in January 2013. Now, right off the bat, despite not having a bachelor's or a master's, I was offered the opportunity to do a PhD, but the project was unfunded, so I decided against it. And instead I took on an MPhil, which is, in the UK, it's termed a Master's of Philosophy, but in paleontology. Now, an MPhil degree is a postgraduate degree, which is a sort of transition between a Master's and a PhD, which I completed in 2015. And then, just last year, I was offered the opportunity to have an honorary PhD, which I turned down, because I was doing lots of research. I'm still going to do this research anyway. And I said, is it possible to find some funding? And the University of Manchester managed to find some funding and fund a PhD, which I've been doing for about a year and a half, roughly. And so that should be completed within the next year or so. And as part of my role at Manchester, I actually do look after students as a specialist advisor, mostly on marine reptiles, but on dinosaurs as well. And so it's a fantastic thing. It's a fantastic career to be a paleontologist. It was something I always wanted to be, and now I've been working in this field for approximately 10 years. Now, my expertise has become ichthyosaurs, but I've worked on a variety of things. This thing here is a new British ichthyosaur, which I described very recently. It was collected prior to 1951 from Normanton Hills in Nottinghamshire. And this is a partial skeleton. You can see here, this is a big orbit. You've got the coracoids here, and the scapula is part of the pectoral girdle, and you've got the lower jaw here and the upper jaw. Well, this thing, again, was one of these things which nobody had ever looked at it. It was in a museum in Newark Museum in Leicester. And having compared this with a lot of material, determined that this was something new to science. It points out the orbit. And I named it after the two people who introduced me to paleontology when I was 18. This is, in the middle, Bill Wall and Professor Judy Messere. So I called this Wallosaurus Messere. And that was published last year. So it's a nice sort of honour to name it after those. Now, I mentioned earlier that Doncaster is sort of well known as it is a coal mining town, and there's lots of sort of mines around the town. And, well, they've all sort of long gone now. And so growing up in Doncaster, there was very few opportunities to go out and collect material. And for me, I was disappointed. I had to at least travel a couple of hours away to go to the coast and find ammonites and stuff. But I was really interested in the geology of Doncaster, what's been found here. I was aware that there's lots of material found down mines. But anyway, a couple of years back now, in 2012, me and a couple of colleagues, an archaeologist and a fossil collector, we decided, let's go looking around Doncaster, see what we could find. And we visited various different sites, and we didn't have any luck. And then Peter suggested, one of the archaeologists, he said, well, Dean, how about we go to this site called Edlington? Now, Edlington is a site which literally is 10 minutes drive away from the house I grew up in. And so I thought, I'm not going to find anything there. Well, to my surprise, about 5 minutes after going there, we found a few fossils, a few plants. And now we've found well over 500 specimens, and including 30 different types of plants. And it's all carboniferous material, it's about 310 million years old. We've probably found some new species and new types of plants as well among all this material. This is some of the most exceptional stuff. But perhaps more importantly, for sort of placing Doncaster on the map for its paleontology, I actually found this specimen, and this was, I think it's 2012-13, and I picked this up and I thought, I know what this is. This has got to be a shark egg case. So I went home, checked out online, quick Google search, as you do, and looked through the books, found everything pointed to this being a shark egg case, and that is indeed what it is. That's the first ever shark egg case found in Doncaster and found in Yorkshire to our knowledge. We also found this thing, a horseshoe crab as well, and we found several other horseshoe crabs since. And so it's important that now we're actually beginning to build a picture up of what the life was like during the sort of Carboniferous time in Doncaster, which is fantastic for me to also sort of give something back to the town I grew up in. And it's good that we were also leading sort of various trips and stuff to the site at Edlington. Now, another project I've been involved in was the study of an African plesiosaur, a thing called Zarathosauria oceanus. Now, Zarathosauria was originally just known from an isolated skull, and when I was at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, working again with Bill, he mentioned to me that there was this really interesting skeleton of a plesiosaur known, and he said, would you be interested in working on this? So I said, yeah, for sure. And so this specimen was collected in Morocco in April 2004, and the two images, this is portions of the neck, this is portion back of the neck, and then you've got some of the dorsal vertebrae, the humerus here, lots of ribs. And so there's a picture from 2012 where I flew out again to Wyoming to study this thing, that's the skull. And here's the skeleton. It's a partial skeleton. It's practically about 70% complete, maybe 60-70% complete. And this is now the most complete example of Zarathosauria known. And there's also been other fragmentary skeletons and partial skeletons found, which we're able now to assign to Zarathosauria because of this skeleton. Now, one of my favorite specimens is this thing, the world's longest death track. Now, this is also at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center. And on my very first day, when I was there way back in June 2008, I had a tour around the museum, and the young lad giving the tour said to me, Dean, have a look at this. So I stood and stared at this thing in the center, and I thought, I've not really idea what this is, maybe some sort of trace. So he said, okay, well, come with me and follow me. And if we look at this, that piece. Here's another piece. Here's another, another, until eventually it's complete. Now this was created by a horseshoe crab. This type of fossil is known as a morticnium, a death trace. It was collected in Germany in 2002 and is 150 million years old. The entire track is 9.7 meters, 33 feet long. It's one of these things which sort of gives me goosebumps even now to talk about it because it's an entire moment captured in time. This horseshoe crab has been flung into a lagoon. You literally, at that first block, you see where it fell on its back, it wriggles around, it rights itself, then it walks for 33 feet and it's preserved at the end. That's an entire moment captured in time. And we don't know how long that took. It may have been 30 seconds, may have been 30 minutes, it could have been a lot longer. But the animal eventually suffocated because it was in this environment where it was anoxic. There's no oxygen, which is a sad story, but it's an incredible fossil. Now, similarly, just this year, I have a little video, so I'm going to play this. Hopefully it'll work. Okay. So just this year, this new study came out of mine, which is the world's longest sort of death drag. Now, what we should be focusing on are these two lines in the middle. Now, when I looked at this thing, I was made aware of this a couple of years ago, and I'd seen a couple of photographs, and I was really intrigued by it. And eventually, I had the chance to go out and see it in October last year, and it's in Barcelona Museum, Cosmo Caixa Museum. Again, this is an interesting thing that it's been on display. Nobody's looked at this thing in any great detail, and you can see how these lines start to get, there's a few more now. You've just got these two prominent ones, but there's maybe 4 or 5 here. There's more and more. And when I saw this thing, I was kind of blown away. Very much I got the sort of goosebumps feeling when I remember seeing the horseshoe crab for the first time. And this thing goes on and on and on. It's a huge, huge thing. It comes from the same area, around Solnhofen in Germany, and is roughly, again, about 150 million years old. Now, I sort of pondered over this. What could it be? Just by looking at an image of these, it looks like some sort of trace fossil. But what is it? Is it a burrow? Is it sort of some sort of drag mark? And obviously, after seeing the specimen in person, it was even more fascinating than I thought it would be. This video is really sort of encapsulates how big this thing is, and you can see that these two prominent lines still continue to go through, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Probably make out a 5th there as well. Yeah, there you go, 5th one. And as the mark gets further and further, you can see that as more lines come along, until eventually you find the culprit of this thing. Now, the culprit, which I'm not going to point out just yet, is interesting because it is a fossil, it is an animal, but it wasn't made by the animal in life. It was made by the animal in death. So the animal was already dead before it made this trace. Or actually, I shouldn't even say trace, because it's technically a geological phenomenon. It's not actually a true trace fossil, and which is why we use the term death drag. It's created by this ammonite. Now this ammonites have a series of gas chambers, and we sort of hypothesized that this ammonite had a bunch of sort of gas left in an empty shell. So it's sort of probably partially empty shell. And we think that it's gone down in the bottom of this lagoon, and it's not sort of fell over on its side straight away. That it must have had some sort of buoyancy. And so with a very calm but steady current, it's been dragged along the sediment. And because, bearing in mind, the sediment is anoxic, nothing is living there, it's not been disturbed. Until eventually this gas has left, where it's touched down and the ammonite's preserved. And that's 8.5 meters in length. And it is incomplete as well. Whoever collected the specimen, which we don't know, whoever did collect it, they couldn't find the rest of it. They didn't at least excavate the rest. So what an incredible fossil. But the fact that it wasn't created by the animal in life. And initially, this sort of trace was also, this sort of mark was also thought to have been made, because we didn't have the ammonites, thought to have been made by things like turtles and fish and stuff. So it really does deserve a lot of interest in this specimen, and it's great to actually have studied this thing. Now, aside from sort of scientific research, I mentioned the Fossils of Whitby Coast book, but this was something that I kind of wanted to do for a very long time. The word dinosaur, as I'm sure you all know, was sort of invented by and coined by the British scientist Sir Richard Owen around about 1842. Now, the funny thing is, since his discovery and naming of Dinosauria, there's been so many dinosaurs named throughout the British Isles. Historically, about 100 different species, and now roughly we kind of agree on about 60. Yet nobody had ever done a book about the British dinosaurs. And see, obviously, again, growing up in the UK, I mean, I read about stuff in North America, amazing stuff, the Morrison Formation stuff, read about the material coming out in China, but there was very few comments about British dinosaurs. And so eventually, working with a good friend of mine, paleoartist, Professor Nobumichi Tamura, we put together this book, Dinosaurs of British Isles. It ended up taking about 3.5 years to complete. It has 416 pages, 800 images. It was a big dinosaur-sized task. Now, for anybody who does know me, obviously I know there's a couple of people in the audience who, good friends of mine and colleagues, I'm very, very passionate about science communication. It is imperative and super, super important that as a scientist, we talk about what it is we do, and that we allow others to understand why we're doing it, what's important about it, and what does it mean for everybody. Now, that's super, super important. I'm very, very passionate about this. And so, as Malcolm mentioned, I've done quite a bit sort of TV stuff. This is a program, a mini-series, which I worked with this lady, Ellie Harrison, who's a presenter. She's sort of a well-known presenter in the UK. I teamed up with her, and she was sort of like the lead presenter, and me as the expert on the screen. If you've got YouTube, you can search this. It's on there. Everything's on YouTube now. And this is called Dinosaur Britain. But I've done lots of other things as well, stuff on CNN, talking about my research, and sharing my passion with others. I actually do have a little clip from Dinosaur Britain, but I don't know if it's going to work. May wish to cover your ears just in case it's super loud.
Careful to take it down.
Can you hear that?
Well, take a look at that. Incredible. Now, that is a portion of jaw, just a lower jaw, of a dinosaur called Echinoderm. This was found on the Isle of Purbeck.
What can this tell you about the dinosaur itself?
So it has two types of teeth in its jaw. It has molar-like teeth and canine-like teeth. And we think that perhaps Echinoderm may have been omnivorous, so feeding on plants and animals, and probably insects too. So quite unique.
How big would it have been?
No bigger than a cat or a dog.
I thought you might like that. So this was a sort of a great sort of endeavour for me. I mean, I'd done a little bit of TV stuff before this, but this was interesting that it was based around my book, Dinosaurs of the British Isles. And what we wanted to do was capture sort of the entire history of sort of paleontology, of dinosaur paleontology in the UK, and bring to an audience for the first time some of the important material that has been found. And we wanted to make it a sort of family audience. It was picked up initially by the channel ITV, and then also the BBC, I think, now broadcast it on various other places across the globe, including Australia. But the key sort of thing with this is that we want to make it family friendly. So we had lots about the science, but brought animals to life during modern day Britain. So instead of saying, a Megalosaurus was 9 meters, you could actually have a Megalosaurus next to a car. So for children, that's very good and visual. And so again, it's really important about trying to get that communication across. And as part of this, we met many leading experts who are working on British material. Now, again, Malcolm sort of mentioned some of the awards and stuff, and this isn't all about sort of self-promotion. This is also just to show that some of the stuff I've been sort of recognised in my field. And I think probably the two things that really stem for me, and really I should point out, is this one was in 2015. I took the idea of the story of Ichthyosaurus anningae and naming it after Mary Anning, and the discovery of Ichthyosaurus anningae to House of Commons, and where I presented my research on this up against 59 other scientists, mathematicians, engineers. I ended up winning a gold medal for excellence in science communication, and it was all about this study. And very strangely, it so happened that the day in which I was presenting this was the day that Mary Anning died as well, which really gave me goosebumps. Very, very bizarre. And then very recently, it's a little bit embarrassing, but it's very good for communication, is that the Royal Society have recognised me as a local science hero in Doncaster, and the Doncaster Museum and Art Gallery have put together a very mini exhibition which is on until middle of September. I'm giving a talk next week about this. It's the sort of final concluding part. And it's a mini exhibition sort of showcasing some of the stuff from my childhood, some of the material I've described, a couple of examples of fossils, and also a bit about Dinosaur Britain and that. And we had a bunch of series of events and that too. And so that's been a lot of fun and very good and engaging for children and families alike. It's kind of in fact, it's not necessarily inspiring people just to be paleontologists, but it's inspiring people to sort of follow their dreams and being able to, if somebody tells you can't do this, you prove people wrong. And it's really important that we do that. If you've got so many people, if you want to be a dancer, a teacher, a nurse, that, these things are plausible. It doesn't matter where you come from. And with that, a bunch of acknowledgements and thanks to all of you. I'm happy to take some questions.